1 Samuel 8:5 says, they told him that since his retirement, things hadn't been the same, for his sons were not good men. And here's where we get to the crux of what we're really talking about this morning, is in this next line. Give us a king like all the other nations have. Give us a king like all the other nations have, they pleaded. Now, Israel was a theocracy, which meant that in their governmental system, God was actually part of the governmental system. He was the king. So they wanted to move to a monarchy where there would be a man who would be the king. A man would become the king. So they didn't simply just want to replace God's system. They, in fact, wanted to replace God. They wanted to replace God. Why? Because they wanted to fit into the world. But here's the hitch. They wanted to fit into the world, a world that did not know God at all. That's what they wanted to fit in. Well, let's consider for a moment what the world was for them, where they sat among these other nations. What were all these other folks like? Well, they lived in a nation followed by around people who did not know God in the least, who had no idea what it was to have a relationship with the one true God. They lived among people who found their personal fulfillment in some really wicked things. They were people who would sacrifice their own children for the sake of their crops. They were people that lived in such a vicious moral darkness that it was just the norm of the society, and that's who they wanted to fit in with. Question, if that's the way the people are, what do you have to do to fit in? How far do you have to go to fit in with people like that? If you're a person of faith, do you think there's any compromise? Any compromise going on? Here's God's response. 1 Samuel 8:7. God says this, do as they say. Do as they say, the Lord replied, for I am the one they are rejecting, not you. They don't want me to be their king any longer. Now, then it goes on, God goes on, and you would have in your sheets a whole dissertation of what it meant to have a human king. And there's some very heavy demands in there that wouldn't be there if God were king. All kinds of things that would be a burden on the people. Lesson from it? It's understandable why they wanted a human king. It was even kind of a convenient thing. They would fit in and all of this stuff. But the truth is simply this, is that whenever you do something for convenience that writes God out of the picture, it is never a trade-up. The exchange is always a trade-down, whether you see it at the time or not. Whether you see it at the time or not. Well, how do I know that? Well, because I'm looking at 2,000 years of history that tell me that. That tell me that's what happened. So Israel refuses to change their mind. And they go on to have a man as king. And God lets them do it. God does that, you know. If you decide you want to do something without him, he's not going to hit you with a thunderbolt. He said, you want to try it? You go ahead. In fact, he often does what he does here. He lets them go all the way. And he lets them have their dream king. I mean, this guy is Dudley Do-Right, Prince Charming, all rolled up in one. This guy, it turns out, he comes from a privileged family. He is, it says, head and shoulders above the rest of the people of the place. He is the most handsome man in Israel. He had all the right stuff, but it was the right stuff on the outside. It was the right stuff on the outside. This fellow they were showing off. So what goes on? Well, things go pretty well for the first year. And that can happen to us too, doesn't it? When we go on our own way. Things go pretty well for the first year. And then the first real test comes along. The first real test, and just at the end of the first year. And the king has had a few little victories and everything, against these Philistines. But the Philistines now decide they're going to hit back. And that's kind of where we are. 1 Samuel 13, verse 5. The Philistines recruited a mighty army of 3,000 chariots, the tanks of the day. 3,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and so many soldiers that they were as thick as the sand along the seashore. And they camped at Michmash, east of Bethaven. When the men of Israel saw the vast mass of enemy troops, they lost their nerve entirely and tried to hide in caves and thickets and coverts and among the rocks and even in tombs and cisterns. Can you imagine how demoralized they must have been? They saw this mighty army, and soldiers were even running and hiding in tombs with dead people to get away from them. So it's a pretty serious thing going on here. And everybody in Israel realizes one thing. If they're going to win in this battle, it's going to have to be by God's hand. And so they turn to God. And God's man is Samuel. Samuel is the connection there. So Samuel tells King Saul, wait for me at Gilgal. Wait there, and I will go and make a sacrifice to the Lord before you go out and face this daunting enemy. That surely they're just going to crush them if God's not with them. So the troops that he have gathered, and they're all shaking in their boots. And they're there with Saul, waiting for Samuel to show up and perform this sacrifice. And they wait, and Samuel doesn't come when he's expected. And people start melting away. The king gets somewhat nervous on this, and he assumes the role of the priest, and he burns the sacrifice. He burns the sacrifice. And it's pretty nasty. It's pretty nasty what goes on here. Well, why was it so bad? Well, it's because he was king. He was not the holy prophet. He assumed a job that was not his. He took on an authority God did not give him. And he was to rule the people, but not to be the spiritual authority. That was Samuel's job. So when Samuel gets there, the passage, the response from Samuel is one of the saddest things we'll ever read in Scripture. In 1 Samuel 13:13, he says, "You fool," Samuel exclaimed, "you have disobeyed the commandment of the Lord your God. He was planning to make you and your descendants kings of Israel forever." God was planning this. But now your dynasty must end. Underlined in there the word must. For the Lord wants a man who will obey him. And as Scripture says in the more traditional verses, a man after God's own heart. Kind of code speak for who is coming next. And he had discovered this man he wants and has already appointed him as a king over his people. For you have not obeyed the Lord's commandment. That sounds pretty harsh. Sounds pretty harsh. Why did poor old Saul get whacked so hard on what's going on here? Well, because, it kind of struck me as I was looking at it. There's two great sins that you and I can commit, or that any Christian can commit. One is God gives you the authority. God gives you the calling to do something and you refuse to do it. That is rebellion against God. However, there are things God has not called you to do, and you do not have the authority to do. And if you go out and assume you do, that is rebellion against God as well. And that's what Saul did. He went out and he did something that he did not have the authority of God to do. He went out and tried to do this, and it was rebellion against God. He knew better. Saul lost a great destiny, not because he wasn't religious, not because he didn't show up at temple every Sabbath, not because he didn't believe in God. Saul lost a great destiny because God could not trust him. He lost a great destiny because God could not trust him. Trust him in what way? Real simple. Just obey. Just obey. There's a lesson in that for us. Any Christian, any person sitting in a church on a Sunday like today, anyone who believes in God, if God cannot trust you, He cannot use you. if he cannot trust you? He cannot use you. There's this story, more than 3,000 years in our past, on the other side of the world, and it still has timeless truths that, you know what, if we don't grasp what's being said in this part of the story, our destiny may not turn out any better than Saul's. There are things we have to take to mind and heart here. Things we have to. Like what? We'll start with this one. God has never called his people to, quote, fit in. He has never called his people to just simply fit in. Now, I don't want you to get me wrong here. I'm not saying God says to be a person of God, you must be a social misfit. That you must be weird, that you must be eccentric. That's not what we're talking about. But I'm telling you this, God has always, always, always called his people to something beyond just fitting in to whatever society we happen to be living in. He calls us to something beyond just fitting in. God has destined us to be different from and different to the world. You are called to be something different from and different to the world. Different in what way? Different in your attitude. Different in your way of living. Different in what you value. Different in how you navigate life. Different in how you respond to the challenges that come your way. Different in all these things in such a way that you make the world sit up and take notice. That you make the world sit up and take notice. And not of you, but of God. Of God. Well, how does that work? How can you and I be this type of person? Well, God gives us this promise. God tells you, and he tells me, that if we allow his Spirit to live and have proper reign in us, to have the proper influence, it says, this is promised to you. If God is living inside you, you will be filled with love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, and self-control. That's in Scripture itself. It says that you will be so connected to God, you will be like the branch connected to the vine. And you will practice religion in your kindness that we talked about earlier, taking care of widows and orphans. You will have a tendency within you and a value system within you where you will take care of people who can't even repay you because they're God's children, because Christ is in them too. He says, even the least of these, if we take care. Those are the kind of things that the world sits up and takes notice, because we're not dog eat dog. It's not what can you do for me. It's not the value system. It's for what's coming down. The bottom line is this. If this is the type of person we are different from the world. We are different, but we're not weird. We're attractive, actually. Strangely attractive. If this is what we are. That is what we're called to be, in being different. The other thing is in this whole thing of fitting in. Fitting in is not the top priority. Just imagine this. Just imagine if Israel, ancient Israel, had not made fitting in their top priority. That they, in fact, had the courage to be different. Just imagine how different the world might be today. But I'm not pointing the finger at Israel. I'm kind of looking back at us. Is that if fitting in and being different, if it would have made that much difference with Israel, how about you? If you chose to be different instead of fitting in as your main priority, what a difference you might make. What difference would you make to your children, your grandchildren, to your spouse, to your neighbors, to your friends, to your community, if you had the courage in a Christ-like way simply to be different? It would be a success if I could have every one of us go out of this place with these two questions that really haunted you all week. And that until you reflected on them honestly. And the two questions that I would ask God to haunt us with through the week until we meet again would be these. One. Fitting in or being different. Right now, Which one is the truer story of your life? Question 2 is this. Judging by your track record so far, can God trust you? Can God trust you? Fitting in or different? Which is your story? Can God trust you? Everything that's going to happen in your faith for the rest of your life depends on those two questions. How you answer them, how you respond to them.